With civilian casualties mounting in Ukraine, the White House officially declares its position that Russia is committing war crimes. Also had a stunning admission from the New York Times about the authenticity of Hunter Biden's laptop. Take a look at those stories in tonight's Hold the Line. Welcome to Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. The conflict in Ukraine drags on, gets worse, more civilian casualties, more atrocities, and now, as we see, even war crimes allegations being made by the Biden administration against Russia officially and out in the open. Here is Secretary of State Blinken saying that Russia is in fact committing war crimes in Ukraine.
Yesterday, President Biden said that, in his opinion, war crimes have been committed in Ukraine. Personally, I agree. Intentionally targeting civilians is a war crime. After all the destruction of the past 3 weeks, I find it difficult to conclude that the Russians are doing otherwise.
I don't think that Vladimir Putin really cares much. I think that he would expect that he would not ever come under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, which Russia left some years ago anyway, as a signatory. And he figures that whatever he has to do to get his ultimate objectives in Ukraine, he's going to go to those lengths. We face, with the Russians, we being, of course, the West, the Ukrainians, America, a very dedicated opponent here, one who is ruthless and vicious and has certainly a willingness to break not just the norms of warfare in a general sense, but specifically to violate the Geneva Convention and engage in war crimes. Now, what are we going to do about all of this? We've already put sanctions in place. We've given more munitions. Well, the Biden administration has stepped up some of the rhetoric, but not a whole lot has changed or shifted about their ultimate position with regard to Ukraine. Here is Nancy Pelosi, for example, who just a few days ago was talking about how she won't want to blow up all the different Russian tanks that she saw in the long convoy. Yeah, General Pelosi, it's a terrifying thought. She says that Joe Biden has done a masterful job managing the situation. Yeah.
For a second and just say, President Biden has done a masterful job in managing this situation in a way that is collaborative, not condescending or dictating, but collaborative. The unity of the G7, not only the G7, but the NATO alliance has been remarkable to behold.
Biden has done a masterful job. And it's terrifying that Nancy Pelosi says that out loud with a straight face, and some people in this country will believe her. Biden voters will believe anything, it seems, that they are told. And there are some who are also wondering, when is there going to be more of a focus on what's going on here in America? Right? We still have a lot of major challenges, crises, in fact, whether it's the border, crime in cities, getting inflation under control, getting the economy running at the kind of pace that we would like to see in this country, dealing with over 100,000 drug, mostly opioid overdoses in this country every year. COVID, what's going to actually happen going forward? Are we still going to be dealing with this? Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to hear it. She wants you to know that it's annoying to ask any questions about COVID because, people are dying in Ukraine. Watch.
Yeah. Yes, Jake.
I just want to dig into that a little bit more on the COVID relief.
This will be your third time.
My third time when I ask about COVID relief?
Yeah.
Well, it's substantive. You like substantive questions. So I just want
Yeah, well, while people are dying in the Ukraine and all of that, yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Pretty snarky from Pelosi. While people are dying in the Ukraine. So no questions allowed about what's going on here in America. Pelosi just swapped those aside. She's way too into the virtue signaling about how much she cares. General Pelosi, ready to go to the front lines, I'm sure. We all know that's never going to happen. Meanwhile, the media is doing everything that they can to help, I think, at some level, the Biden administration keep the entire focus of the public's attention on the situation in Ukraine, a country that, while certainly at war and it is terrible what's going on over there, it is thousands of miles away, and we have a very large country here with a lot of other things that are in fact going on. They certainly don't want to talk to you about this, Hunter Biden's laptop. Turns out that whole laptop story, the one that big tech suppressed right before the 2020 election, actively shut down, pretended it was disinformation or the result of hacked material, whatever they had to do. They threw all their weight behind the Democrat candidate. It is appalling what big tech did, because we had been led to believe for a long time that they were platforms, that they were not actually publishers. They didn't have editorial positions that they would use their enormous influence in the dissemination of information to push one way or the other. Well, it turns out that was all a lie. And also the very idea of Hunter Biden's laptop as anything other than entirely real, corroborated, and true, that was also a lie. New York Times confirming today the laptop is authentic. People familiar with the investigation said prosecutors had examined emails between Mr. Biden, Mr. Archer, and others about Burisma and other foreign business activity. Those emails were obtained by the New York Times from a cache of files that appear to have come from a laptop abandoned by Mr. Biden in a Delaware repair shop. The email and others in the cache were authenticated by people familiar with them and with the investigation. So that is real. That is true. The laptop always, and I know for a lot of you watching, you're saying, Buck, haven't we known this for a long time? Yeah, but now they're admitting it. They really haven't actually done any additional reporting per se. They haven't done anything to authenticate this other than just admit what was already known, but what was highly politically inconvenient for them right before people were casting votes for Joe Biden or Donald Trump in the 2020 election. And the media has no regret about this. As you know, their job in their own minds is to advance the cause, the narrative of the Democrats, the left, the progressives. So for them, it's not an issue that they were incredibly, stunningly wrong on this, because it was to a purpose. Propaganda. That's what they were doing. Here you go. Remember this one? Back in the day when this was actually underway, the suppression of this story, the NPR put out a statement on why they're not covering the Hunter laptop story. We don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories. And we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions. That was the managing editor for news at NPR, which gets, of course, taxpayer dollars to be a crappy left-wing news source among so many others out there. And not only did they lie, but the current president, then candidate himself, Joe Biden, back in October of 2020, lied and said that this is a Russian disinformation campaign. Watch it.
His own national security advisor told him that what is happening with his buddy, I will. His buddy, Rudy Giuliani, he's being used as a Russian pawn. He's being fed information that is Russian, that is not true. And then what happens? Nothing happens. And then you find out that everything that's going on here about Russia is wanting to make sure that I do not get elected the next president of the United States, because they know I know them and they know me. I don't understand why this president is unwilling to take on Putin when he's actually paying bounties to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan.
That was a lie at the end there, too. He's lying about the laptop. He's lying about the bounties. He's saying that Russia's scared of him. Apparently not, Joe. Apparently not. And then even last year, in April of 2021, Hunter Biden was able to get away with playing this game with the media that he didn't know if it was his laptop. And the people in the media, the lib journals, were all, oh yeah, that seems credible, watch.
And when they ask you if that was your laptop, you say you don't know, which is hard to believe unless you read the book. Yeah. And then it's kind of like, I'm surprised you have shoes on. Yeah.
Yeah. I made it today. Pants were the problem. Yeah.
Pants are always the problem, really.
Yeah. No, look, I really don't know. And the fact of the matter is, it's a red herring.
He's lying, obviously. And Jimmy Kimmel was there to launder the lies with laughs. That was the point. Ha ha ha, you couldn't even know. Of course it was his laptop. Only a presidential election hanging in the balance here. No big deal, right? Disgusting. We have more on the delayed authentication. Yeah, as if they authenticated it, really, of Hunter Biden's laptop with the deputy editor of Real Clear Investigations, Ben Weingart, when we come back. First, I want to talk to you about protecting your online data. A lot of companies promise your privacy is guaranteed. We know that's not true. That's why you need a new privacy and cybersecurity application tool called Secure. It's spelled S-C-K-U-R. Secure uses proprietary encryption and is offering secure instant messaging and email. would secure all of your communications based on servers and data centers hosted in Switzerland. Privacy is a big issue now. Without real security, people can read your emails, messages, even your bank information. Secure will never mine your data, never ask for your phone number. You can send emails to your banker, doctor, lawyer, anybody with total confidence knowing you're not being spied on by big tech. Secure is your solution to stop the constant theft of your digital identity. Costs only $5 for the messenger, only $10 for the messenger and email combination package. Go to secure.com and take back your privacy today. That's secur.com and use promo code BUCK for 25% off. We'll be right back with more. Hold the line. Today's revelation by the New York Times that Hunter Biden's laptop was in fact authentic might come as a surprise to some on the left, but if you were paying attention back in 2020, pretty obvious from the very beginning. The laptop contained explicit photographs of Hunter, emails that were authenticated by recipients, and a provenance that led directly to a computer repair shop in the same town which Hunter Biden had a home in, or rather Joe Biden has a home in. Despite the obvious fact that the laptop and contents were real, the left clung to the idea that it was Russian disinformation, a claim that many of them had to know was an outright lie. As late as September of last year, the White House was still sticking with that BS story. Watch.
The president has said, and you have tweeted, that allegations of wrongdoing based on files pulled from Hunter Biden's laptop are Russian disinformation. There is a new book by a Politico reporter that finds some of the files on there are genuine. Is the White House still going with Russian disinformation?
I think it's broadly known and widely known, Peter, that there was a broad range of Russian disinformation back in 2020.
Okay.
Disinformation, huh? Joining me now is the deputy editor of Real Clear Investigations, Ben Weingarten. My friend Ben, good to see you.
Buck, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I wonder, I mean, there's, on the one hand, there's the outrage that any normal person would feel who's paying attention to the election, that the media just completely lied about this, and then when it finally doesn't really affect them anymore, you get this sort of kind of maybe, all right, it was all real, we lied to you thing. How do we have any accountability for this whatsoever? I mean, I guess for me the problem is I already think the media lies all the time, so what are we supposed to do about it?
Well, it's also three layers of people or entities that are culpable here. It's the media, which ran with a letter signed by national security, law enforcement, intel officials who hated Donald Trump's guts and wanted him ruined from before his election in 2016. So you have a media that worked hand in hand with the national security apparatus through virtually the entire presidency and before to try and take him down. Then you have big tech, which also suppressed the story. And we've seen polls to indicate that substantial percentages of voters would have been swayed had they been aware of what transpired. There's the real world impact of all of this, which is that the Biden family's dealings, the real story around Hunter Biden and other Biden family members who profited from deals with all manner of foreign powers, including Russia, Ukraine, and communist China, is to what extent does that impact national security and foreign policy when Joe Biden was vice president, and now today when he's the commander in chief, the president of the United States. So all of these different layers of accountability have never been addressed. And when it comes to our media, it is remarkable how brazen they are. I mean, let's not forget the New York Times buried this 24 paragraphs into a piece. They talk about burying the lead. The headline is not, yes, we've now confirmed after more than a year and a half what everyone else knew, including a Politico reporter and dozens of other sources, that this was real, this was not Russian disinformation. And by the way, of course, those national security officials have never been held to account or recanted or retracted. But remember, almost every aspect of the Russiagate, Russian collusion conspiracy theory, which the media served as the stenographers for this very same national security and intel apparatus, all of the lies from the Steele dossier and all the poisonous fruit onward, they have never retracted virtually any of that. I mean, the Washington Post has come out and retracted a couple of things, but they have not handed their Pulitzer Prizes back, which were based in garbage. It was a fraudulent information operation. So let's stop talking for a second about Russian disinformation operations. What about our ruling class's disinformation operations to destroy American political dissenters from their orthodoxy?
And you mentioned the different aspects of possible corruption that came up here in the Hunter Biden laptop story and that also were quickly covered up, right? I mean, we knew about this, and then all of a sudden the media says, oh, it's a non-story. NPR says we wouldn't waste our time with such a thing. It's pretty outrageous in retrospect, but I also feel like it's unsurprising. And you mentioned all the different people from the intelligence community, for example, who came out and said it was Russian disinformation. I think in their minds, Ben, they are totally willing to be intentionally, absurdly wrong as long as it serves the political purpose of the moment. I don't think they care about credibility or ethics or integrity, which is why there's no embarrassment now when this comes out.
Yeah, to your point, it's all about the ends justifying the means. And since you started by asking about that question of accountability, I think that's really everything in the scheme of things. If no one ever pays a price for malfeasance, whether it's the creation of the entire Russiagate information operation, whether, as we reported for Real Clear Investigations just a week ago, Paul Sperry did this amazing report connecting all the dots, showing DNC, Obama administration, Ukrainian official collusion in the run-up to the 2016 election on behalf of the Clinton campaign and against the Trump campaign. When it comes to every single aspect of these efforts, impeachment number one, and all of the machinations around that, created in part, by the way, it seems, by Eric Ciaramella, who was essential to Democrat Ukrainian Hillary Clinton campaign collusion against the Trump campaign. If there is no accountability for any of these officials, and we've become familiar with all of these people who otherwise would have been never heard from in our bureaucracy, the Peter Strzok's of the world, Andy McCabe, on down the list, Stefan Halper, all of these shady, shadowy figures who essentially worked to try and bring down a candidate and then a president of the United States. If none of them ever pay a price for their malfeasance, whereas their political opponents always pay the maximum price. I'm thinking now, for example, of the January 6th Unselect Committee and its jihad against political dissenters. Well, we don't have a republic anymore. And we have the full weaponization of all of the powers of the federal government, legitimate powers and then illegitimate powers that it's usurped against political opponents. And I've been writing about that for a year and a half. The war on wrongthink, the war on dissenters in this country is the most damaging, disturbing revelation that we've seen over the last 5 years.
They'll send the DOJ after you. In fact, back in December 2020, Biden lied, of course, said the laptop is disinformation, and then essentially suggested the DOJ may look into it. Watch.
Thank you.
Mr. President, on Russian disinformation, Mr. President, do you still think that the stories from the fall about your son Hunter were Russian disinformation and a smear campaign, like you said?
Yes. God love you, man. You're a one-horse pony. I tell you. Thank you. I promise you, my Justice Department will be totally on its own, making its judgments about how they should proceed. Thank you.
My DOJ? What? What was that?
The very same DOJ that says that parents are terrorists if they dare to question draconian coronavirus policies or racial Marxism, critical race theory in schools. We're supposed to have confidence in that DOJ. The DOJ that apparently acts with a double standard when it comes to those who engage in political violence on the left versus those who engage in political violence on the right. It's laughable. You know that virtually the entire deep state has basically cast anyone who dares ask naughty questions about 2020 election integrity or coronavirus policies, or in the DHS's latest terror bulletin, you have them questioning anyone who dares to dare ask a question about the wisdom of allowing unvetted Afghan refugees by the thousands into the country, cast them as potential terrorist threats to the country and potentially the preeminent terrorist threat to the country. So we know that all of these various bureaucracies have been weaponized against opponents. I mean, it's scary to think this way when Joe Biden speaks like that, beyond the fact that he just shrugs off the millions of dollars that his family has taken in from corrupted and often adversarial countries. But then to say my DOJ is on top of it, the only way that you hear that, the way that I think you should take that if you're prudent right now, is this is like a mob boss saying, oh yeah, they'll take care of it. They'll be sure to cover it up and make sure it never sees the light of day.
Ben, we'll come back with you here in the next segment in just a moment. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Recently released footage shows a man detained by police in 2020, California Highway Patrol, pleading that he can't breathe. The man then died in police custody while he was saying that. It's a familiar sounding story. It is not George Floyd's story. I'll dig into the details coming up next. Stay with us. A shocking, never-before-seen video has been released showing the final moments of a Los Angeles DUI suspect who died after being pinned to the ground face down by California Highway Patrol as they tried to take a blood sample. The victim, Edward Bronstein, can be heard screaming, "I can't breathe," repeatedly until he died in police custody. Warning, the video is very disturbing and it is hard to watch.
You're bringing the fight to this, not us.
I'm not fighting it at all.
Then have a seat and provide your arm. This is your last opportunity. Otherwise, you're going face down on the mat, and we're going to keep on going.
I'll do it willingly. I'll do it willingly. I promise you will. I'll do it willingly. I'll do it. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
Just stop yelling.
I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't breathe. I can't.
This horrifying incident took place 2 months before the murder of George Floyd, a case that shocked the nation and sent protesters flooding the streets to riot and destroy parts of major U.S. cities. But will there be outrage over the murder of Edward Bronstein? Will there be riots? Will there be justified lawlessness? A national conversation? Let's bring in Deputy Editor of Real Clear Investigations, Ben Weingarten, to talk to us about this. Ben, thanks for staying with us.
Thanks for having me, Buck.
I think it's unfortunately very likely here that we'll see that the first inclination of the Democrat-aligned left-wing media in this country when there's an incident of police violence isn't even necessarily to gauge the use of force in and of itself, but to figure out, well, is the victim an African American? If the answer is no, the police violence seems markedly less important to them.
I think you're right. And it's really sick and cynical. And we should say this is a harrowing video. So set aside the identity politics, set aside the merits or demerits of the cops' training and what the policies and practices are in California. It's a horrible video to watch. Unfortunately, I think the first inclination of our benighted corporate media is to always go towards, is this story useful to our agenda or not? And when it comes to acts of police violence on suspects, that usually goes right to identity politics. And you see this with all manner of stories. When the media is very open and transparent about who a victim or an aggressor is versus when they hide it. And you see it start to trickle out in social media, and then you wait 12 hours, and then you suddenly find out the identities of those involved. And that's sad, because what the media ought to do, if we had a media that actually cared about imparting knowledge and information about events so that you can make decisions for yourself, is that they ought to report without fear or favor. But so often, instead, people use their privileged positions in the media to advance agendas useful to them, or like we just talked about in that last segment, to suppress stories that cut against narratives that would hurt them. And that's what I think we'll probably see here. I suspect, I hope, we're not going to see damage and devastation wrought across the country. And it's really remarkable to step back and look at it almost 2 years later, the anti-cultural revolution that did sweep the country when the media felt the identity politics were ripe to take advantage of and exploit a horrible situation.
And you mentioned this, the George Floyd protests triggered riots in America not seen in decades. Some would say the only riots that were similar in scale would have been after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. back in 1968. So going back quite a ways, and obviously to a very tragic incident with the assassination of MLK Jr. And I do, though, as I look at this, the situation of the individual who died in custody of the California Highway Patrol, I have to say there was this immediate rush right when the George Floyd incident happened, not only from the media, but corporations all across the country, to suggest that this was representative of law enforcement in terms of racism, but wasn't really about the policy or the procedure that was used per se. It was really the cops are racist, so we all have to go now and march in the streets about racist cops. This video, as horrific as it is, shows that there are other instances of individuals who suffer from the tactics used here of police doing a immobilization hold of some kind, putting knee on the neck, knee on the back, shoulder blades, etc., and that this is something that was happening elsewhere in the country. It just feels like, Ben, if we had talked about police brutality and the specifics of the incident with George Floyd with regard to police tactics, instead of just acting like that was representative of racism all throughout law enforcement, maybe we would have gotten sooner to policies that would prevent this sort of thing from happening instead of having the country go through riots for months.
Yeah, absolutely. And inflicting in the process tons of damage, between $1 and $2 billion of damage, it's estimated, on cities across the country, leading to the pulling back of police forces and defunding of police forces, which has generated, at the very minimum, coincided, and I think it's pretty clear, caused a massive uptick in violent crime, threatening, terrorizing law-abiding citizens in cities and suburbs across the country. So to your point, of course, they didn't want to grapple with the merits of what happened, even though it would have been better for the country. Instead, the first inclination was to jump to race. And by the way, when it comes to the Floyd incident, there's no evidence that this was a racially driven incident of the police forces. And the other aspect, if we're going to talk about the politics of these things, which I find really beyond distasteful in the first place, but the media forces it there, is what about the fact that these are often police forces in blue cities or blue states, other blue jurisdictions? So if police are systemically racist and it's happening in blue locales across the country, then is it that the Democratic Party is systemically racist? I mean, of course, they don't want to grapple with the implications of the rhetoric that they spew, but they ought to be asked about that.
I think that's true. And you see that while they talk about police reform in the context of criminal justice reform, that's a phrase that sounds good to people, Ben. But criminal justice reform, as it has been practiced by progressive prosecutors in cities across the country and law enforcement agencies now in those blue jurisdictions, has resulted in a whole lot more crime, more murders, more assaults, more rapes. And you have to wonder, at what point does the left recognize that many of their narratives around these issues are just more destructive?
Yeah, fomenting injustice in the name of social justice. And ironically, it's the most woke cohort among leftists, when you look at polling that's been done on this, is white liberal elites. That's who pushes this. White liberal elites who don't have to deal with the consequences of these policies ultimately. It's the people living in the most dangerous areas who have to deal with the consequences of these Soros DAs across the country. So it's disastrous all around. The American people can make Democrats pay at the ballot box, but we're talking about decades of punishment being inflicted on blue locales across the country because of these very dangerous ideologies that then manifest themselves in even more dangerous policies.
Ben, thanks again for your time today. Good to see you.
Buck, it's my pleasure. You too.
As the negotiations to re-enter the Iran nuclear agreement continue, President Biden might be getting ready to hand the Islamic Republic a big victory that'll have implications for the war on terror. More on that with the Heritage Foundation's Peter Brooks when we return. First, I want to talk to you about protecting your online data. Hackers capitalize on uncertainty, and Russia's invasion is the type of chaos that can put American homeowners at risk of being hacked. You can expect scams like robocalls, texts for fake donations, and emails with unfamiliar attachments. We know those scams. There's a bigger scam that's hard to detect and harder to stop. It could cost you your home. Called home title fraud. It happens when a hacker finds your home's title online, forges your signature, takes out loans, leaves you with the bills. This is very difficult to detect in advance unless you have the right people on your side. That's Home Title Lock. All you have to do is go to HomeTitleLock.com and enter your address to see if you're already a victim. Smart to do this. Good practice. Go to HomeTitleLock.com. Again, that's HomeTitleLock.com. We'll be right back with Peter Brooks. Stay with us. The White House might be on the verge of making a big concession to Iran as the Biden administration is considering the removal of its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from the terror blacklist, reversing a key policy from the Trump era.
Is the White House willing to delist the IRGC from the foreign terrorist organization list in order to get a deal with Iran?
We're still in the negotiations, so I'm not going to speculate or outline from here what the final details look like.
And these are likely the group responsible for firing missiles at U.S. facilities in Iraq. So as long as Americans aren't killed, are there no consequences for something like that, all in an effort to get a nuclear deal?
Interesting questions. How far will they go to restore that Iran nuclear deal? And what will the cost possibly be to our national security? Let's ask Senior Fellow of Weapons and Mass Destruction and Counterproliferation at the Heritage Foundation, Peter Brooks. Peter, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you.
Just let everybody know, because it's not getting really very much attention in the media at all right now. What's going on with this Iran nuclear deal?
Well, the Biden administration for about a year now has been trying to get back into it or renegotiate something else. They talked about it being longer and stronger. And now, after a rounds of negotiation, it looks like they're going to do something that's shorter and riskier. They seem to be moving back into the original deal, which the Trump administration got out of for good reason. Now, we're all trying to find out what we can in the news and from other sources to find out what's really going on in these negotiations. But as you saw with that White House presser, they're not telling us a lot.
So what is this IRGC move? If this were to happen, how big a deal is this? And also, are there other concessions that are reportedly underway on the U.S. side that everybody should be aware of?
Well, I'm worried we're going to go back to the original deal, which is in 2015, which was seriously flawed. I mean, first of all, it had sunset provisions, and that's a kind of a diplomatic term, meaning that certain provisions of this will expire. And some of them are going to expire in the next couple of years because we're already several years into this agreement, especially on issues of uranium enrichment, which allows Iran to move towards a nuclear weapon. The original deal also didn't capture ballistic missiles. And of course, this is an ideal way to deliver a nuclear weapon. I mean, Iran has the Middle East's largest arsenal of ballistic missiles. And you just heard the reporter refer to the attack last week into Iraq with ballistic missiles from Iran. They share them with their friends, such as the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas. There's other issues as well, as the inspection regime of the original agreement is troubling. It doesn't allow for any time, anywhere inspections, which in my view is required if you're going to have any sort of confidence in an agreement. And Iran has put all of its military facilities and bases off limits to the International Atomic Energy Agency's inspectors' looks. So this is, the IRGC is really the one, and the military are the ones who are moving forward this nuclear program. Which in my view is going to lead to a weapons program, and it has been a weapons program in the past. So there's all sorts of things. The other thing, Buck, is that the Iranians never came clear on what they were doing previously, called the possible military dimensions. They denied they ever had a nuclear weapons program. The Israelis spirited some information out of Tehran, which they shared with the world, showed that they did have a weapons program and it had designs to build up to like 5 nuclear weapons. But the Iranians, as part of the agreement, were supposed to show everything they had and everything they had done to the IAEA, so the IAEA could sufficiently and effectively monitor this agreement. So there's real problems even with the original agreement. And now we hear that there may be things such as delisting the IRGC, perhaps transfers of money to Iran, which anytime you put money in Iran's pockets, it's going to go for things like military modernization, supporting Hezbollah, supporting the regime in Syria, supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So this is very troubling. But once again, we don't have a lot of information. The administration is not keeping us up to speed on what's going on in these negotiations in Europe.
Peter, there has been some reporting that there will be concessions made to Russian interests, and particularly in the fossil fuel sector, with regard to the Iran nuclear deal. Can you walk us through that? Because I think a lot of people, given what's going on with Ukraine right now, were saying, wait a second, we're doing carve-outs for Russia in an Iran nuclear deal?
Yeah, that's fuzzy too. The administration's not telling us a lot directly on this, not on the record. But what we're hearing is, remember, the Russians were the ones who allowed Iran to build its first nuclear reactor at Bushehr. If you remember, that goes back, gosh, to the 1990s. And they're involved in servicing this reactor, and their nuclear agency wants the ability to do business there. I mean, this is one of Russia's, besides the export of energy, this is one of the other fields that they're very heavily involved in is nuclear power. And there is rumor out there that that's exactly what the administration has done, is given them a carve out. Now, originally, they wanted an entire carve out to say that they could do on other issues of doing business with Iran. But what we're hearing now is that they're just talking about the nuclear sector. And I think this is obviously a bad idea as well, considering what we're seeing going on in Ukraine.
Peter, switching gears here for a moment to the situation in Ukraine. You're a nuclear weapons and nuclear proliferation expert. In the background of all the conversations about should the U.S. do a no-fly zone, how involved should we get, what should the NATO allies do, there are people who keep reminding everybody that there are thousands of nuclear weapons in Russian hands, and things come up like tactical nuclear strike as a possibility. How much of a worry is that for you? I mean, essentially, Peter, from what we know, what would make Putin launch a nuke? Under what circumstances? I mean, I know we don't have clear answers, but we must have some idea.
Well, we're obviously closely watching this. I mean, we're involved in a situation that involves a nuclear weapon state, and Putin has brandished his nuclear weapons. He talked about increasing their alert status to a special combat duty regime, which everybody's trying to figure out exactly what that means. But there also, you mentioned a couple of things, Buck. One is the tactical nuclear weapons. Russia has about 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons, which is basically a 10-to-1 advantage over us. We have about 100 stationed in Europe with NATO, and we have 100 back here in the United States. And the concern is that the Russians might use these tactical nuclear weapons, which are lower yield nuclear weapons than the big ICBMs we think about, the city busters. They might use them in what's called a escalate to de-escalate strategy. In other words, if things weren't going very well for Russia, Russia could explode a tactical nuclear weapon over, Ukrainian territory, even over the ocean, to send a signal to those who might be intervening or playing a role in the Ukrainian the Ukrainian crisis, that Russia means business and they may go further. So, including to bigger nuclear weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missiles. So there's a concern that Russia might actually use these, and this would break the 75-year taboo or international norms against using these sort of weapons. So there's a tremendous concern. Russia has 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons at the ICBMs level that could be used against the United States, that are restricted along with ours under the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. But yeah, when you're dealing with a nuclear state, this is something to worry about, especially considering our concerns about the state of Vladimir Putin's views on the evolving situation in Ukraine and in Europe.
Peter, thanks for the expertise. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Former CNN anchor Chris Cuomo is naming names, accusing several of his former colleagues of engaging in blatant misconduct. Oh, CNN fighting with CNN. This will be interesting. Got that coming up in Quick Hits. Chris Cuomo takes aim at his fellow CNN colleagues in a court filing, and the American Federation of Teachers apparently doesn't know what the Ukrainian flag looks like. Aren't many social studies teachers apparently in the group. Let's take a look at this all in Quick Hits. First of all, CNN, what a mess that place was and still is in so many ways. Very bad people in the senior leadership there, including the now ousted Jeff Zucker, who is a nasty fellow. And some of the anchors there are also deeply narcissistic, dishonest, and bad people. And Chris Cuomo, whatever you think of him, is taking shots at some of them. Former CNN anchor Chris Cuomo bashed fellow CNN anchors Don Lemon and Jake Tapper in a court filing. CNN fostered a culture in which Exceptions to the network standards and practice were routinely sanctioned, and that culture began at the top with Jeff Zucker and Gullis. As long as CNN's ratings would not be hurt, Zucker and Gullis were more than willing to overlook major transgressions by CNN personalities such as Don Lemon and Jake Tapper, or even to engage in blatant misconduct themselves. Oh man, I'll have to read more of this because I want to know what this misconduct is. I mean, if it's being essentially pundits pretending to be journalists, well, of course, that's what Tapper does, what CUOMO does, what all of them do. It's ridiculous. Anyone who watches them thinks they're watching journalism, which isn't very smart, but that's what CNN's audience, they still buy into that stuff. So, yeah, he's taking shots at some people here. We'll have to see. There's a lot of money at stake. He's suing them for millions and millions of dollars. What a mess. What a joke CNN has turned into, and it is a place that, well, hopefully we'll have to do a whole house cleaning there. The American Federation of Teachers is run by Randi Weingarten. Randi Weingarten is really a propagandist for the left. She doesn't really care about kids. She cares about adults who vote Democrat, paying their teachers' union dues and giving the Democrats a lot of votes. That's really the job. It's certainly not about children. Let's remember that the American Federation of Teachers worked directly with Dr. Anthony Fauci in the run-up to school closures to make sure that schools were closed down because adults were so scared of the virus. And then, of course, pretty much everybody got sick anyway because, you can't stop the virus. They pretended. But anyway, Randi Weingarten, we've seen they've now moved. The mass mobilization of the left has gone from total COVID panic and paranoia to all things Ukraine. They all care so much about Ukraine all the time suddenly, even though very few of them can find it on a map. And I think even fewer of them would be able to pick out the Ukrainian flag. Here is Weingarten holding up a "We Stand with Ukraine" sign. The Ukrainian flag is upside down, but guess they didn't really want to look that one up beforehand. You all know that I think that Dr. Anthony Fauci is responsible for more misery, despair, and health reductions and even perhaps untimely deaths from things like deaths of despair than any other person in America. I think he has been catastrophically damaging during COVID, not helpful, in fact, in the least. He's a little megalomaniac. He's a tyrant, and what he's done is awful, in case you're wondering what I think of this guy. But he disappeared for a few moments there, and we were making some jokes about trying to find him, lost in the couch cushions like the little tyrant Lilliputian that he is. And it turns out Fauci has reemerged, but this is the even more important part. He's reemerged to let everybody know we might have to mask up again and do all that crap that didn't work the last time, 100 times that he told us to do it. Watch.
We have to be careful that if we do see a surge as a result of that we're flexible enough to reinstitute the kinds of interventions that could be necessary to stop an additional surge.
That could mean a return of mandatory masking, especially in areas of high transmission.
They've never been able to stop a surge with this crap. I mean, how many times do we have to go through? Doesn't work, doesn't do it, has no effect. At least Governor Ron DeSantis is out there pointing out that, for example, the travel mask mandate on planes is something that only morons or totalitarians could support. Watch.
And if you look now what they just did, they extended the forced masking on airplanes and on transportation. Now think about this. You go on an airplane, and if you just want to sit there and read a magazine without a mask, they say that's the worst thing in the world. But if the person right next to you pulls the mask down and fake sip on water for 2 hours, then they don't have to wear the mask. I mean, give me a break. This is theater. This should not be extended. It should have never been done in the first place, but clearly now this is a farce.
It is a farce. Speaking the truth, it's what we do here. That's it for tonight's Hold the Line. The No Spin News with Bill O'Reilly is next. Shields high.